Hello and welcome to the Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was the Black Keys with When the Lights Go Out. On this week's episode, I would like to talk about a paper that has recently been published in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and this is a very prestigious publication that is published by an American institution, and this particular piece of work was conducted by 4 researchers that are located here right in Cornwall, right in Penryn at the University of Exeter's Penryn campus. So I thought it would be nice to kind of profile the really nice work of some of our neighbors up on the hill, and also to talk about a topic that I haven't really addressed much in the past on the show. And that's actually not an easy thing to do these days, because I have had over 100 shows now. This is 2 years that I've been doing The Wild Side, and I tend to repeat topics a little bit. So sometimes I revisit my favorite topics, other times I look at kind of new developments in certain things, but after a while it has gotten a bit hard for me to find brand new things, and this is one that I think I haven't really gotten to at all before. And in fact, there are kind of 2 different things I haven't really talked about. The first is biogeography, and the second is time partitioning in animals. So thinking about how animals do certain behaviors at one time of the day versus another. And the study that was performed by these researchers was one in which they looked at how different animals choose different types of time partitioning regimes, if you like, around the globe. And they were trying to look at whether these different kind of schedules of the animals vary from one place to another in some sort of a consistent pattern. Now, the reason that they embarked on this is because this is actually a topic that hasn't really been looked at much at all, but they also had some applications in mind for it, and I'll get to those a little bit later in the broadcast. Now, just to start off with some background, we know, of course, that the Earth is subject to natural cycles of light and darkness because of the way that it rotates around on its axis, and so is exposed to the sunshine at sometimes, and to that lack of sunshine, or to the nighttime at other times. And because of this, there are going to be effects that almost all eukaryotic organisms are going to have on their environments, because they are going to be exposed to these variations in the amount of light that they're receiving. Now, of course, there are some species for which this isn't true, and also some habitats for which this is not true. So, for example, if you have species that are always within something else or otherwise contained, then they maybe won't ever realize that something is going on externally that has to do with fluctuations in sunlight. So, for example, some of the parasites that dwell within us, if they're not impacted by the things in our bodies that are impacted by changes in light, then maybe they have no responses ever to these fluctuations in the sun's rays. Also, you might have certain types of habitats that are just so deep underground, or they're deep underwater, and these never register changes in ambient light either. And then, of course, the species that dwell in those areas aren't going to have, or are unlikely to display any significant effects. However, this is not true for the vast majority of organisms that we know about, and that's why this is an interesting sort of thing to study, to think about how these fluctuations do impact these species. And all points on the Earth's surface receive approximately equal portions of light and dark throughout the year, but of course we know that latitude impacts how light is distributed throughout the annual cycle. So, for example, where we are, we tend to get some very long summer days relative to where I was when I lived in the US. But as nice as that is during the summer, it's not always as nice during the winter, because we have some incredibly short days. In other places, they have a better balance of those things, or they have maybe the reverse, depending on where they are. So when the sun is below the horizon, we know that there is this seasonal and latitudinal variation in what the researchers refer to as the duration of biologically useful semi-darkness. So when the sun is below the horizon, it's not necessarily completely dark. You're going to have twilight when the sun has just set. You're going to have twilight when the sun is about to rise. Also, we have the moon, which can provide quite a lot of illumination. And these things can also be impacted by the weather, which, if you've got a lot of clouds, can have an effect on how much of the twilight light and moonlight rays are able to come through to us. And we know that animals could use visual cues associated with these variations, in order to make active decisions about really important behaviors that they're engaging in during these times. And this can include a range of things from foraging to predator avoidance to reproductive behaviors to even just kind of self-maintenance, whether or not they're going to be sleeping or grooming or that sort of thing. Now we also know that in addition to how much darkness or light there is, there's going to be a really important effect of temperature, because temperature can constrain how much an animal decides to pursue those various activities that I mentioned during periods of appropriate light conditions. So there are metabolic costs of thermoregulation that an animal has to balance with the need to do those other behaviors, which themselves can have some costs or can be associated with costs of not being performed. And thinking about this in kind of a specific example, you can think about the fact that if you are a desert-dwelling animal, then obviously you need to eat at some point. You need to go out and find a mate at some point, and you want to do this when the relevant organisms are active. So if you are going to go out and catch insects, for example, as your food, you want to go out when those insects are active. If you need to get a mate, you want to go out when that potential mate is active. But we know that in the desert it can be extremely hot during the daytime. And that means that you either need to do your behaviors at night, or you need to do them just before or just after the sunrise and sunset. Now, that sounds like kind of an easy solution there. You just go when there's very little sun or no sun at all. But you also have to think about the fact that when there's no sun at all in the desert, it can be really cold. And so the animals have to kind of figure out where in that remaining time are they actually going to kind of target their behaviors. So they have to balance all of these things out and think about how much time do they really need to do all of these things, how important is each one of these things, how difficult is the thermoregulation at each of those different times, and then find the balance. And of course, this is not a thing that the animals are actively thinking about, which my wording kind of suggested, but this is something that will be shaped over time as these animals adapt to these habitats and evolve in these habitats. And the ones that kind of choose the most appropriate behaviors are going to be the ones that are successful and survive, and then pass on the genes for doing those same sorts of things over and over. And it can be equally difficult to be active at nighttime when those temperatures are low, and also in the daytime when the temperatures are too high. So going out, for example, in the desert during that really hot daytime can be just as difficult as going out in that really cold nighttime. And so that's one of those situations where you have to see which one is going to be more or less beneficial, or I guess which one is the lesser of the two evils. And it might even be the case that in some places there is no really obvious choice, and so species have to be active throughout both light time and darkness hours in order to kind of balance the give and take of those costs and those benefits. So they just kind of pop out every now and then here and there and distribute their activities across the available lighting conditions in order to not maybe necessarily choose between those lesser evils, but to have just a little bit of each, and maybe that's the compromise that they seek. So what the researchers were looking at was the idea that some of these animals can have temporal niche partitioning, which means that they're going to specialize in using certain pockets of time, basically. And if you have different animals that are using maybe some of the same resources but are active at different times of day, then that allows you to have more animals in a given space because they aren't directly competing for those resources. And that means that you can have lots of things specializing in avoiding competition and having sorts of specialties for a portion of the light gradient. And that means that after a while you can start to have lots of animals that have certain types of characteristics in terms of light use within certain areas. And maybe there's a biogeographical pattern then that emerges from those aggregations of things that have certain types of preferences for one type of lighting or another. And this type of partitioning can be associated with a range of different adaptations that allow these things to be possible. So for example, we have species that have certain types of visual systems or eye morphology, or have certain types of energetics and resource use that allow them to survive in these areas. So if you think, for example, about owls, owls have those gigantic eyes, they have a really great hearing, that allows them to sense things in the dark. With bats, you've got echolocation that allows them to navigate and also to find potential prey items. You have all sorts of things like this that can allow an organism to do well at one time and not another, or to do particularly well at one time and not another. And you've got other species that may live in the very same place that don't have those things, or maybe they have other things that allow them to specialize at other times. And that's why you can have all of these organisms living in the same place on different schedules. One of the things that we know a lot about here in Britain, because we interact with foxes and hedgehogs and animals like that, is kind of nocturnal animals and also crepuscular animals. Crepuscular animals being the ones that are active just before sunrise and just after sunset. So they're there kind of in the twilight hours. One of the things you might not have heard about so much is animals that are cathemeral. And cathemeral animals are the ones that have significant and often random or sporadic activity during both the day and the night. So you've got cathemeral, you've got crepuscular, you've got nocturnal, and of course you've got diurnal animals, those that are around during the day. So these are kind of the four different general states that we tend to find emerging from these various aggregations of characteristics that allow animals to specialize in one of these kind of light settings or another. There can also be species that are a bit more facultative, which means that they are a bit more flexible depending on the conditions. They don't necessarily have to be crepuscular or nocturnal or whichever. They can kind of fluctuate in when they do things. Sometimes this might be because these animals have seasonal or geographical variations in their strategy. Sometimes there might be variation within or among individuals because of habitat structure or food availability or age or temperature or the presence or absence of predators. So in other words, a lot of these animals can actually gauge what's happening in the environment and then respond accordingly. So sometimes, for example, we know that animals that are young will do one type of thing, and then as they age, they switch over into a completely different type of methodology for interacting with the habitat. So we know that there's a continuum, basically, of time partitioning strategies, and you've got nocturnality at one end and diurnality at the other, and then all these other different possibilities in between. And the strategies can be thought of as functional traits in and of themselves, but they can also be thought of as part of suites of other traits, or at least associated with other traits. Those things that I mentioned earlier, those things like echolocation and the use of large eyes for vision, and cumulatively all these things have really significant implications for the ecological roles of the species and of the individuals within that species, because collectively the traits that these guys have and the times at which they choose to employ those traits to allow them to do things in the environment, that affects what exactly they're capable of doing. So for example, whether they're harvesting a particular type of nectar at night, as we know that some bats do and some moths do, and then allowing those night blooming species to reproduce, which then has implications for habitat structure, which then has implications for all the other species that are able to live in that habitat or not. So that can have huge effects on the whole ecosystem, just these combinations of traits the animals have that are related to light use and benefiting from certain types of lighting or lack of lighting in order to just do their daily activities. Now, despite the huge importance of this ecology of time partitioning, we don't really know that much about it, to be honest. So we know when some species are active and when some species aren't active. We know that some traits are associated with certain types of schedules, but to be honest, we don't really know what the biogeographical distribution of these different activity patterns is. And that's kind of surprising because we know that these traits are affected by both light and temperature, and both of these things vary at different latitudes, as I mentioned at the beginning of the show. So you would think that this is kind of an interesting thing to look at, because you might start to suspect that there could be little patterns or big patterns, depending on the scale that you're looking at, around the globe that are associated with how animals have evolved to deal with their conditions. And of course, right now this is a really important and kind of urgent thing to know about, because climate change and anthropogenic light pollution are both impacting the conditions that are going to be found for a number of animals around the world. And we know that this could have a big contribution then to how these animals are doing in the wild and whether they are likely to survive or need help with conservation initiatives. Now, just to talk a little bit more about light pollution, I think we all know a fair amount about climate change, but light pollution is quite interesting because we know that individual point sources of light can have a localized effect, but maybe we tend to think that, it's just going to have an impact on your front garden or on a road or on a certain car park area. But actually, when you have lots of lights together in a village or in a town or especially in a city, then all these things start to add up and they create what's called sky glow. And sky glow results from the fact that particles in the atmosphere can reflect the light from down below, and this allows them to increase illumination over large areas. And I'm sure that you all have seen sky glow at some point or another. As you've been driving along at night, maybe off in the distance you see a big orange patch along the horizon, and that might be a city that is, maybe even an hour away from where you are right now, but you can still see that light at that great of a distance. And the bigger the city, the farther away you are and can still see that light. And so of course this can have huge impacts on the organisms that live there, as I've mentioned previously on the show in the context of thinking about birdsong and the birds singing at night because they have this amazing amount of light. So of course, if you look at these areas of light, you can actually see that there is as much lighting from artificial sources as you can measure from the moon on a really full moon night in the middle of the summer, for example. And this is potentially quite a harmful thing because natural cycles of light have been consistent over extremely long geological periods. That means that the organisms that live in these habitats are really in tune with the natural conditions. They have no reason really to be evolutionarily flexible to this sort of pattern in the environment. We shouldn't expect them to be able to respond really quickly to changes in these lighting patterns. And we also know that their responses to the ambient light can be associated with really important behaviors. So if we change the way that things are, then this could have really significant impacts on how these animals are reproducing and surviving, how healthy they are, how big their populations can be, and all sorts of things that are really important for maintaining the species over the long term. So this is a really important time to get kind of a baseline reading in order to make predictions and do comparisons later on if, and this probably will be the case, climate change and anthropogenic light pollution continue to have impacts on the environment and may even increase and have larger impacts in the future. So if we can better understand the biogeography of time partitioning, then that will allow us to better predict where light pollution and where climate change are likely to have the biggest impacts. And this could hopefully allow us to kind of act now to preserve things or to set plans in place now before things get really bad. So that brings us to the current study. And this was designed to look at the biogeographic patterns of natural variation in illuminated activity time, which is the amount of time that you can go around in your habitat doing things. So this is going to be a balance between when light is actually available and when the temperature is facilitating your ability to do those activities that you're interested in. Because as I said, we know that sometimes it's going to be too hot or too cold to be active, even if the lighting suggests that this would be a perfect time for you to go out and about. So we know that 12 hours of sunlight at a pole is not the same as 12 hours of sunlight at the equator, and this is why the researchers are trying to kind of figure out what are the sorts of variations that we see around the globe relative to the amount of lighting that these places get within a year, and from one time of the year to another, and the amount of temperature, the amount of heat that they get from the sun as well. And they also wanted to look at how well temperature predicts the patterns that we see in the biogeography. And mammals were used as a study group because they have a global distribution, they occupy a wide range of habitat types around the world, they also display a wide range of time partitioning behavior. So all of those four categories that I mentioned earlier, nocturnal, diurnal, cathemeral, and crepuscular, we see all of those in mammals. And we also already have a good deal of evidence that anthropogenic light pollution is affecting mammalian species, and there are several species that already are the subject of quite a lot of concern from a conservation standpoint. So this seems like a really good place to start. So that gives you all the background of this study. Now I'm going to give you a bit of a break, and then we'll come back and talk about how the researchers collected their data and then what they found. Welcome back to The Wild Side. This is your host, Kight, and that was the Be Good Tanyas with Moonlight. And on today's show, we are talking about a recent study performed by researchers from the University of Exeter's Penryn campus about the biogeography of time partitioning in mammals. And before the break, I gave all the background as to why the researchers are interested in this topic, and now I want to think about the methods that they use to look into these patterns. So first of all, the mammal data. Well, they were able to download range maps of almost 5,300 different species from the IUCN website. And they classified each of the 5,300 species according to its light use patterns. So obviously this required a huge amount of research, and they had to look in books and journal articles and online databases, and they even had to consult with experts whenever they couldn't find anything written and published about these species. They ultimately had to exclude 184 species that are fossorial, which means that they live predominantly underground. So this is things like moles, for example. They found information for approximately 2,900 species, and then had to interpolate another 355 at the genus, family, or order level when there was sufficient data to do so. So this meant that they didn't necessarily have specific data about certain species, but they had enough data about lots of other closely related species, or they knew about, so for example, if they had a particular species that they didn't have data on, but they had some kind of general statement about the genus or the family or the order, they then could use that kind of as a proxy for that particular species and interpolate from there. So they were able to kind of figure out another 350 or so that more or less likely had this pattern, even though it wasn't documented 100% in the literature. They also included about 1,100 bat species, of which all but the fruit bats were considered nocturnal, and fruit bats are often diurnal, so that's why they had a different classification. So in total, when you do all the math there, they were able to include just under 4,500 different species in the analysis, and only exclude 612 non-fossorial species that they didn't have sufficient information on. So the reason this is interesting is that, first of all, that's a huge sample size for them to look at, which is really impressive, because when you've got that number of species to include in your study, it means you can probably find some really interesting patterns and be sure that they haven't occurred just by chance. The other interesting thing is that the fact that they had to exclude 600-some species suggests that there are a lot of animals out there for which we simply do not have enough information. And this is actually not entirely surprising if you've ever looked at conservation databases online. You always run across lots of species for which people are worried, or that they say, maybe this is endangered or otherwise, a species that needs help, but we simply don't have enough information to put it on the list and say that it's actually endangered. So there are lots of species out there for which we have very little fundamental baseline data, because there are tons and tons of species and only so many scientists around to study them. So clearly this is an area where more research needs to be done. And in particular, the scientists determined that China, Central Africa, and New Guinea are all places where we really need to concentrate more efforts in order to figure out more about these species. So the next thing that they had to collect data on were global light patterns, and for this they used the CRU 2.1 data set. And this is something that provides monthly grids of observed climate around the world between 1901 and 2002. So clearly this is another really important and really useful data set that's available actually free of charge for these and all sorts of other scientists out there to download in order to figure out how climate affects the patterns that they're studying. And it provides information on things like temperature, precipitation, vapor pressure, and cloud cover in these little 0.5 degree latitude grid squares all around the world. So for this study, the researchers harvested information not for that whole time period, but for the period from 1961 to 1991. and they calculated daily duration of daylight, which is the duration for which the midpoint of the solar disk is above the horizon. They also looked at daily duration of twilight, which is the duration for which the center of the solar disk is between 0 and 12 degrees below the horizon. And they also looked at full moonlight, which is the duration during which the illuminated fraction of the moon is greater than 75%, and the center of the solar disk is more than 12 degrees below the horizon, and the center of the lunar disk is above the horizon. And I'm not sure that all makes a lot of sense when I say it out loud, but hopefully you can kind of picture the visual in your mind as I say that. So basically, they're just thinking about where the sun and the moon are in the sky, and using that to calculate how much light that those celestial bodies are presenting to the Earth during that time. They also derived the timing of the sunset, the sunrise, and the positions of the sun and moon, which they could do using astronomical algorithms. And then they created global maps of illuminated activity time by adjusting each component of the daily light cycle using climate data. And this reflected the effects of both cloud cover and seasonal temperature restrictions. So obviously, during periods when there was more cloud cover, there was going to be less moonlight and less sunlight available. And during periods when it was extremely hot, it was not going to be possible for animals to go out. Likewise, when it was extremely cold, the same thing. And the range of temperatures over which they were measuring this kind of potential behavioral window was 0 to 35 degrees. And they assumed that below 0, you're not going to have very much activity, and above 35, you're not going to have very much activity. And it might be the case that there is some amount of activity below and above those kind of endpoints, but it's probably very low, and it might actually have negative repercussions and lead to death. So it's not going to be a common thing, and it's not going to be a sustained thing, probably for the majority of the animals that they were studying. They estimated monthly sums of illuminated activity times and then looked at the variance between months to then create this index of seasonal variation in natural light. So once they had all those calculations done in general, they were able to kind of average across the months and then look from one month to the next how things are fluctuating in a given region. And of course, when you've got places around the equator, you're not thinking that there's likely to be a whole lot of variation from one time to another, because we know that it stays pretty similar there year-round. But the higher north and south you go, you can expect quite a lot of variation, because you know that you have those really long days and really long nights, and as you get up towards the pole, you can actually have entire days and entire nights where basically the lighting conditions are pretty much the same, because the sun is just going around at the horizon or just straight up in the middle of the sky. So that enabled them to kind of look at those extremes and everything in between as well. And the distribution of artificial nighttime light that they used in order to figure out how much anthropogenic light pollution was found in each spot was derived from satellite data for the year 2009 from the Defense Meteorological Satellite Program. So again, they were able to tap into lots of different databases where all this information can just be had for analysis. The final thing that they did was conduct a phylogenetic analysis. So this is thinking about how the relationships between the different species studied affected the patterns that they saw. Because you might expect that the closer things are together in the family tree of mammals, the more likely they are to have similar behavioral patterns. So for example, you might expect that monkeys and gorillas and chimps and humans might all have some similarities because we are all in the primate section of the tree, whereas we might kind of differ quite a lot from things like ungulates or things like the marsupials, because they are all in another section, or another two sections, I should say, of the tree. So they're looking to see whether these kind of familial relationships do affect the way that the animals are behaving. And actually, where you don't find that, things do start to get really interesting. And they were able to do this analysis by cross-referencing their data set with another data set that had recently been published, where researchers went through and looked at a lot of the different mammals that they know that they have fossil data for and genetic data for, and they created a really huge phylogenetic report to look at how these species are related to each other. And there was an overlap of 3,510 species that were found in both of the data sets, both the current study and that previous phylogenetic report. And these are the ones that they were able to do this particular analysis on. So once they had all these different sources of data, the researchers created models that allow them to look to see which factors best predicted the patterns that were produced by their biogeographical maps. So for the spatial analysis, they tested annual ratios of biologically useful twilight, moonlight, and daylight against variation in monthly values of those ratios, and also satellite-derived information on the artificial light. They then also, for the phylogenetic analysis, calculated something called Pagel's lambda. And this is a value that explores the relationship between phylogeny and time partitioning strategy. So basically they calculated this thing that allowed them to kind of compare what the relationships were that they saw versus kind of a false family tree that basically had no phylogenetic signals at all. So where you have random strategies that aren't associated with family relationships whatsoever. So in kind of the null case, you've got a certain lambda value that you would expect, and then you've got the case that they actually studied, and they compared how similar were those two values, and that allowed them to figure out the extent to which phylogeny, or familial relationship, was likely to predict how these animals behave when the light is or is not available. Welcome back to the Wild Side. This is your host, Caitlin Kight, and that was the band with Twilight. And on today's show, I am talking about some recent research from scientists at the University of Exeter's Penryn campus, and they have done a study looking at the biogeography of mammals. And just before the break, I was talking about the methods that they used in their study, and now I want to get to the meat of the report, which is the results and the discussion. So what did they find, and what does all of this mean? Well, what are the global patterns of light use? That is the major question being asked here. They found that 69% of mammals are nocturnal, 20% are diurnal, 8.5% are cathemeral, and 2.5% are crepuscular. Now, some people suspect that nocturnality is an ancestral characteristic of the mammal group, which is why this is probably such a common thing. The very first mammals that evolved likely were nocturnal, and so this is kind of the default state that's passed down from one species to another as they evolve. And then only a few species here and there throughout time have changed and done something different, and then they kind of probably pass this on to their close relatives as well. So we do in fact see a significant phylogenetic conservation and time partitioning strategy within mammals, which means that if your relative is nocturnal, you're likely to be nocturnal as well. The next question that they asked is, what are the global distributions of species richness within temporal niches? Well, they found that species richness of both nocturnal and diurnal mammals is greatest in the humid tropics, and this is not dissimilar from other biodiversity gradients. We just tend to see lots of richness in the tropics. There tends to be a lot of variation, a lot of characteristics, probably associated with the fact that there are just so many animals, period. There are also lots of different habitats, period, and so we just have a lot of stuff going on there. And that's why we have quite a lot of richness. But there is also some variation even within these areas. So for example, the authors talk about South America, where you've got some zones that have lots of diurnal species, but others that have lots of nocturnal species. So for example, along the river corridors, there are lots of primates, and so that's where you will have these kind of bands of diurnal activity. But then in seasonally dry forest and shrubland that's up in the north, or in more kind of cool areas that are up in higher altitudes, you tend to have more bats and rodents. And in these areas, that's where you have those bands of nocturnal species. So even in the areas where you think there's just a whole lot of variation, you still can find certain patterns if you look at the right scale. The cathemeral species richness was highest at mid to high latitudes in the northern hemisphere, and this was particularly noticeable in central Siberia and also in the mid-latitude mountain ranges, so for example the Alps, the Pyrenees, and the Appalachians. And they also found this characteristic quite a lot in Madagascar. Crepuscular activity is fairly rare globally. As I said, it's only about 2.5% of all species, but they also did find aggregations of crepuscular species in southern Africa, in India, and also China. So that is something that does happen kind of in little pockets for some reason or another. Now, when shown as a proportion of total species richness, not just as absolute values, the biogeographic patterns were particularly noticeable. They found again that nocturnality is the global norm, but diurnal patterns are quite dominant in high altitude areas where nighttime temperatures are quite low. So nocturnal behavior is going to be quite energetically expensive because it's so cold, the animals have to work a whole lot to keep themselves warm, whether that means they're running around or they're burning through a lot of calories, and so it's just not a thing that they can do. They need to be out in the daytime instead. They also found that crepuscular and cathemeral activity patterns dominate in the Arctic, which has really long hours of twilight and also high seasonal variation in daylight hours. So all of this, it's very common sense. It's quite obvious how this would develop. The next question that they asked is, what is the global variation in the amount of illuminated activity time relative to temperature suitability? So again, just to remind you, thermal activity time is defined as that space between 0 and 35 degrees Celsius. Anything below or above that, they kind of assume that the animals were prohibited from being too active because it's too cold or too hot. Illuminated activity time is defined as daylight, moonlight, and twilight. And then what they found was that outside of thermal and illuminated activity time, activity is either greatly reduced, most likely, or imposes significant physiological and adaptive costs. So this is what they kind of inferred from all of their background reading prior to doing the study. Now what they found is that the proportion of thermal activity time illuminated by daylight is approximately 50% throughout the humid tropics. And this is not entirely surprising, again, because we know that things are quite steady along the equator. You can kind of expect that because of the way that there isn't a huge fluctuation in the sun in the sky, where it is, how high it is, and what it's doing from one season to another, that you're going to have this kind of average where daytime and nighttime are basically split. And what they found was that there were constraints according to high daytime temperatures in the Sahara, in the Arabian Peninsula, the Indian subcontinent, and Australia. And again, none of this is very surprising considering how completely hot those places are during the daytime. Really, I was going to say during the middle of the day, but actually it's pretty much any time the sun is up, those places are extremely warm. And so that's why you're going to have basically half of the amount of activity time that you would find in other illuminated spaces, because those areas are just so hot that the animals can't be out all of the time. In the high Andes, the Rocky Mountains, the Tibetan Plateau, and other areas like that, they found that nearly all thermal activity time falls within the daylight. So these guys are going to be constrained by low nighttime temperatures. And this is going to be true at high latitudes in the northern hemisphere, especially where much of the thermal activity is going to happen within those long summertime days. And of course, as you get towards the winter, when things are much shorter and much cooler, then you have a lot of things that are much less active, potentially even going into hibernation. The distribution of activity time illuminated by moonlight broadly follows global gradients in cloud cover. And they also found that long hours of twilight occur at the high latitudes where the sun is close to the horizon for long portions of the year. So given all of this, how well could they predict species richness within each temporal niche by looking at the spatial gradients in light? Well, they found that global patterns in time partitioning appear to be coincident with patterns in illuminated activity time. So in other words, the availability of biologically useful daylight, twilight, and moonlight are all constrained by temperature. Now, the one exception was diurnality, which was not predicted very well in relation to the other three conditions. So the other three conditions had 67, 70, and 74% likelihood of being predicted by what the temperature and what the lighting conditions were like. But diurnality only had a 21% rate. Now obviously this is noticeably lower than those others. What they found was that diurnality is more frequent where daylight hours are high and also more variable, and where twilight is limited. So areas that they identified as having surprising amounts of diurnality were parts of Africa, Borneo, and also southern South America. And this was not really a pattern that they could predict very well or explain very well. And so what they suggested that these regions should be explored further in order to better understand this pattern. And actually some of this might also be further explained if more animals are included in the study in the future. So some of those species that they had to exclude, if those species were from these areas, maybe that could help elucidate some of these patterns. Now they also found that nocturnality is more frequent in regions that had low ratios of both daylight and twilight, and low variance in daylight. And finally, crepuscularity and cathemerality. Crepuscularity is most strongly influenced by the availability of twilight, not at all surprising, because that's what it means to be crepuscular, and also to a lesser extent both moonlight and daylight. And then they found that cathemerality is influenced by variation in all three different types of lighting. So none of those patterns is exceptionally shocking, to be honest. The really interesting one was the fact that diurnality was so hard to predict. They also looked at the effects of artificial light, and what they found was that they were less than those of natural light gradients, but they were still quite noticeable, and also that they impact all different types of species. Now, because of the scale at which the data were collected for this particular study, the pattern may not reflect temporal niche so much as human density, so it might be kind of a proxy in this case, and just to kind of reflect the fact that human activity, human effects on the habitat can impact these animals regardless of what their lighting preferences are. But it also could be tentative evidence that the temporal niche is something that could influence extinction rates, because humans affect lighting, and then lighting impacts whether or not these animals can go about business as usual. They found that distribution of artificial light is associated with a decline in the proportion of diurnal and crepuscular species, and also an increase in the proportion of cathemeral species. However, nocturnal species didn't really appear to be that affected. And interestingly, a similar pattern is found if you look at the IUCN Red List and investigate what type of temporal partitioning is displayed by each animal on it. So for example, 70% of non-threatened species are nocturnal, 19% are diurnal, 9% are cathemeral, and 2% are crepuscular. But then if you look at the threatened species, 59% are nocturnal, 30% are diurnal, 7.5% are cathemeral, and 3.5% are crepuscular. So again, nocturnal and diurnal species are quite high there, and although nocturnal species are unaffected, there is that link between the number of diurnal species that were impacted by artificial light and the number of diurnal species that are on that list. Now, it's possible that cathemeral activity might increase as a result of habitat fragmentation, and we know that this is possible because diurnality can be a barrier to movement between habitat patches. So we know that perhaps these animals are having to shift their patterns and when they're active and when they're doing things because of these fluctuations in light conditions, and this can impact how easy it is for them to get from one habitat patch to another and go about their lives. We also know that nocturnal activity may minimize contact with humans and therefore could be a useful adaptation, whether it's an adaptation that the animals develop in response to humans, or whether it's something they already had adapted to in their environments and then can use that beneficially in the presence of humans. Who knows? It could be either of these things happening, and you'd have to look at each different species to really know. And basically, the authors do recommend getting more information in order to better understand the links between anthropogenic land use change and also time partitioning strategy. But certainly the current results suggest that there is something interesting there worth looking at. So overall, the results indicate that light and temperature both can influence species distributions and functional traits, and therefore could also have impacts on responses to environmental change, both climate change and anthropogenic change. And in fact, light and temperature combine to define the available niches that these animals have in their habitats, and also to constrain community structure, to allow animals to live in one place or another, to be out and about at one time of day or another, and interact with each other during those times and in those places. And this is likely not just true for mammals, but also for other taxa, so things like birds, things like invertebrates, etc. And so we need to investigate that in more detail to really understand the extent to which these factors could influence animals around the globe. We also know that environmental constraints may have influenced the evolution of temporal traits, but evolutionary history could also influence which strategies animals could employ, regardless of the environments in which they live. So, for example, we know that lemurs and not many other primates have cathemeral habitats. Likewise, we know that the majority of marsupials are nocturnal, but these sorts of patterns are not the ones you would have predicted simply by looking at the maps that were created here. So that means that there are other factors that are influencing these characteristics that are shown by these animals. These could be things like habitat structure, competition, human disturbance, predation pressure, all different sorts of things. And in order to understand that, you would have to look at each one of those life history characteristics within each one of those species in order to really start to get a fuller picture of what's going on here. So we're talking about a much larger scale study eventually. So this is kind of laying the groundwork for that kind of future research. Now, to sum all of this up, the authors say that although we can now see these broad trends in where the different types of animals are found, we also know that human modification of the environment is having huge impacts on temperature and light. And so what we've got now is a baseline, but it could be changing in the near future. And in fact, it probably already is reflecting changes from the past, because we know that these things that we've been introducing into the habitat, we've been doing that for decades and decades. And so likely the patterns that we see now are already different from the historical patterns. So the next step is to look at particular at-risk species in order to get a more fine-grained approach, to look at data for these individual species and make specific predictions, develop some mitigation and conservation plans, and see whether we can help these animals if in fact we do think that changes to the temperature and changes to the lighting pattern are going to influence whether or not they're able to use the habitat and thrive in it. And to really do this effectively, we'll have to do more studies on physiology and behavior and distribution, and also local changes in specific places to light and temperature. So for example, you might have a national park that you're interested in, or an area that you know has quite a lot of biodiversity, and so you want to target those spaces. And so this really is just pinpointing where we need to get started in order to really apply these results to particular species in particular habitats. So that is all from me for this week. Hopefully you know a bit more about biogeography and habitat use in mammals according to the variations in lighting patterns and also temperature. And hopefully also you appreciate the fact that we do some really interesting research up on the University of Exeter's Penryn campus. And hopefully I will be able to profile some more local research in the future as this stuff comes out, which it does all the time. So on that note, I will leave you with Bugg singing Lightning Bolt, and I will talk to you next week.